We were 4 teenagers on a fishing boat that was not ours, on an errand that should have taken 3 hours, and the engine died at dusk with the coast still in sight. That is the part nobody can get past. When I tell this in a room, that is the sentence people stop me at. We could see the hills. Not a smudge, not a suggestion. Hills with the shape of them, the 2 humps south of our town, and the notch between them that everybody uses to line up on the reef entrance. We could see the place where our mothers were. For 2 days we watched it, and then one afternoon it was not there anymore, and after that there was nothing in any direction for 49 days. I was 17. Wilma was 19 and he was the oldest. Segundo was 17 like me, 3 months younger, and Tito was 16 and small for it, and had been the youngest of every group we had ever been part of since we were 6 years old. I am 44 now. I teach at the secondary school in the same town, which surprises nobody more than me, and about once a year some student finds out and asks me about it in front of the whole class, and I have a version I tell them that takes about 4 minutes. This is the longer one. This is the one I have never told properly to anybody except Wilma, and he was there. Our town is on the coast of Ecuador, in Manabí, and it is not on any list of places you have heard of. Perhaps 3,000 people. A beach where the boats come up on rollers because there is no harbour, a road that goes inland to the highway, a church, and a line of shacks along the sand, where the women buy the catch straight off the boats at 6 in the morning, with a hand scale and a roll of notes in a plastic bag. Everybody in that town is connected to the water. My father crewed on other men's boats his whole life and never owned one. My mother sold fish in the market at Porto Viejo 2 days a week. The 4 of us had known each other since primary school, which in a town that size means we had known each other in the way that brothers know each other, including all the parts you would not choose. Wilma was the leader and always had been, not because he was the biggest. He was not. Segundo was, but because he was the one who decided things. He had left school at 15 and had been fishing 3 years by then. Segundo was quiet and enormous and could carry anything and had a laugh you could hear from the road. Tito was the clown. Tito was the one who talked. In any group of 4 there is one who talks and one who is quiet, and one who decides and one who watches, and I was the one who watched, which is presumably why I am the one telling this. It was March. The season was slow. And Wilma's uncle, his mother's brother, a man called Don Aurelio, who owned 2 boats and a truck, and was as close to rich as anybody in that town got, needed his smaller boat taken down the coast to a yard at the next town south, about 25 miles, to have her hauled out and have work done on the shaft. That is the whole of it. That is the errand. She was a wooden boat, about 9.5 meters, open forward with a small cuddy and a wheelhouse the size of a phone booth, an old Isuzu diesel, and an insulated hold amidships that would take about a ton of fish on ice. Her name was painted on the bow, and I am not going to write it here because Don Aurelio is still alive, and he has had enough of this story. Wilma was supposed to take her with one other man. The other man did not come. He had been drinking, which everybody knew and nobody said, and at 6 in the morning he was not on the beach. And Wilma, who was 19, and who had wanted for 3 years to be trusted with a boat, made the decision that changed all 4 of our lives, which was to go anyway and to take his friends. I want to be careful here, because for years afterwards, there were people in that town who talked about Wilma in a way that was not fair. It was not a stupid decision. It was 25 miles along our own coast on a calm morning the flat season, in a boat he had crewed on 100 times, on a run that boys of our age did constantly. If you had asked any of us that morning whether we were doing something risky, we would have laughed at you, and so would every man on that beach. What we did not do was tell anybody the whole truth, and that was the thing that cost us. Because we were 16 and 17 and 19, and because there is a beach at that town to the south, with a place that has music on a Friday, we told our families we would stay over and come back on the bus the next afternoon. So nobody in our town expected to see us for a day and a half, and the yard in the south was not expecting the boat at any particular hour, because that is not how it works. You turn up. So we vanished into a gap of about 36 hours where not one single person on Earth was wondering where we were. Here is what was aboard. A tank of diesel about 2/3 full, a hold with an old tarpaulin folded in the bottom of it, and a plastic drum lashed in the corner, holding what we thought was around 100 liters of drinking water, which Don Aurelio kept aboard because he was a careful man, and because his crews were not. A gas stove, a single ring on a small orange bottle, a cast net about 3 meters, in a bucket, 2 hand lines with hooks, a machete, a bailing scoop, a jerry can of engine oil, a toolbox with a lot of the wrong tools in it, 4 bunches of green bananas we had bought on the beach that morning, 6 bread rolls, a packet of biscuits and a bag of limes, and a radio which had been broken since January. That is the part that the report focused on, and I do not blame it. But every boat on that beach had a broken radio, Nobody fixed a radio in a slow season. We left at 6:30 in the morning and everything about the run was fine. It was a beautiful day, flat, with a long low swell, and we were making about 7 knots with the coast 1.5 miles off the whole way, and Tito was on the bow with his shirt off shouting at the dolphins that came in and out of a bow wave for about 20 minutes in the middle of the morning. I remember that clearly. I remember being extremely happy. We were 2 hours from the yard when the engine started to run rough. Wilmer knew what it was, or thought he did, and he was probably right. Water in the fuel. It is the most common thing in the world on those boats. There is condensation in a half-empty tank, and the fuel comes from a drum on a beach and has been transferred 3 times, and there is always some water in it, and there is a filter with a glass bowl, and you drain it. He drained it. It ran better for 20 minutes. Then it ran rough again, and then it stopped, and then it would not start. We spent the entire rest of that afternoon on that engine, 4 boys with perhaps 5 years of practical experience between us, working in a hot engine box with the wrong tools. We drained the filter 3 more times. We blew out the fuel line. We bled the injectors, which Wilmer knew how to do and did correctly. We got it to fire twice, for about 4 seconds each time. And then Segundo cracked the pipe union on number 2 injector line trying to tighten it, and after that there was no chance at all. And we all knew it, and nobody said anything for 10 minutes. The sun went down at about 6:15. Here is the mechanism of this whole story, and I did not understand it for years. We were 4 miles off the coast when the engine died. 4 miles. And along that coast at that season, there is a wind that comes off the land in the evening, and a current that sets offshore and to the northwest, and neither of them is very strong, and both of them are absolutely relentless. We had an anchor. It was a small Danforth with about 40 meters of line on it, and we put it over on the first evening and it did nothing at all, because we were in water more than 100 meters deep, and 40 meters of line hanging in 100 meters of water is a decoration. We had 2 oars, sort of, 2 long paddles that were used for pushing the boat off the beach. 4 boys took turns paddling a 9.5-meter wooden boat towards the land for most of that first night. I want you to picture that, because it is the last time in this story that any of us believed we were in charge of anything. We paddled from about 7 in the evening until about 4 in the morning, in shifts of 2, and by dawn the hills were further away than they had been when we started. That is a specific thing to learn about the world at 17. Effort does not always produce result. Sometimes, the world is simply larger than your arms. The first day we could still see the coast. We could see it well. There was a moment around 11 in the morning when we saw a boat, a small one, inshore of us, going south, and all 4 of us stood up and waved shirts and screamed until our throats went, and it went on and away. It was probably 3 miles from us. It might as well have been in another country. The second day the hills were low and blue, and you had to know where to look. On the 3rd morning I woke up first, which was unusual, and I stood on the cuddy roof and turned all the way around twice, and I did it again, and then I sat down and waited for the others to wake up because I did not want to be the one to say it. There was nothing, in any direction, just the joint between 2 blues. Now I am going to tell you about the 49 days, and I am going to tell you the part that matters most first, because everybody wants to hear about the fish and the thirst, and they are not the point. The point is that 4 boys who had known each other since we were 6 years old built a government. I do not mean that as a joke, and I do not mean it as a metaphor. Within about 8 days we had rules, offices, a schedule, a system of rationing, a procedure for making decisions, and eventually, and this is the part I am proudest of, a court. Nobody taught us any of that. There was no adult. The oldest of us was 19 and had left school at 15. We invented every piece of it out of arguments, and the arguments came first, and the rules came out of the arguments the way a scar comes out of a cut. Wilmer was in charge, and everybody accepted that immediately and without a vote, and I have thought about why. He was the oldest by 2 years. It was his uncle's boat. But mostly it was that on the second night, when we were all frightened and nobody was saying so, he said out loud that we were going to be all right, and that from tomorrow morning we were going to work like a crew, and then he assigned each of us a job before any of us had thought to ask for one. That is leadership at 19. Not a plan, because he had no plan, but a schedule. The jobs were these. Wilmer took the water and the decisions. I took the food and the fishing, because I was the best of the 4 of us with a line which everybody knew. Segundo took the boat, bailing, the pumps, the lashings, everything physical, because he was the strongest and because he was the kind of person who is calmed by lifting things. And Tito took the watch. The watch was the least real job of the 4, and it was the most important. Tito's task was to look at the horizon in a slow circle every hour of daylight, and to be the only person permitted to do it. That was the rule, and Wilmer made it on about the 4th day, And it was the single cleverest thing that happened on that boat, because before that rule, all four of us had been looking at the horizon all day. Constantly. Every one of us, every few minutes turning to check for 8 hours a day, and it was destroying us. Hope on that scale, applied continuously, is not a fuel, it is a solvent. It takes a person apart. What Wilma did was to make looking into a job that belonged to one person for 1 hour at a time, so the other three were not allowed to do it, and had to do something else, and the something else was the thing that kept us alive. The water rota was written with a nail on the inside of the wheelhouse door. 4 names, a mark for each cup, twice a day, and Wilma poured it, and every time he held the cup up so all 4 of us could see the level before he handed it over. Nobody asked him to. He did it from the first day. Tito once made a joke about it, and Wilma did not laugh, and he never did it again, and I understood years later that Wilma had already worked out the thing that destroys groups in that situation. And it is not thirst. It is the suspicion that somebody else is getting more. The shade rota was Segundo's, and it was purely practical. The only shade on that boat was the cuddy, which 2 people could lie under if they were friendly, and the wheelhouse, which was an oven but out of the sun. 4 buoys and 2 shady places in the equatorial Pacific in March. We divided the day into blocks and rotated, and the one in the sun wore a shirt on his head and sat in the stern, and everybody did his turn. And then there was the rule about home, which was mine. This came out of the 2nd week. What was happening was that in the middle of the afternoon, always the dead part of the day when there is nothing to do, and the heat presses on the top of your head, somebody would start talking about their mother, or about the festival in August, or about a girl, and it would go round the 4 of us and get more and more detailed, and everybody would join in, and then, about 20 minutes later, the whole boat would be silent, and nobody would speak for 2 hours, and one of us would usually be crying quietly and pretending to be asleep. I noticed it maybe 3 times before I said anything, and when I did, what I said was that we should not be allowed to talk about home until it got dark. Wilma thought about it and then made it a rule, and it held for the rest of the 49 days. And what happened is that home became something we did in the evening, on purpose, after the sun went down, when everybody was lying on the deck anyway, and there was nothing else to do. It became a ritual instead of an ambush. Every night after dark, one of us would start, and we would go for 2 or 3 hours sometimes. Tito used to describe meals. Segundo talked about his sisters, all 4 of them, in enormous detail until we knew them better than we knew our own families. Wilma, who almost never talked about himself, talked about wanting his own boat, and the strangest effect of that rule was that the afternoons came back. Once we could not think about home in daylight, the daylight had to be filled with something else, and what it got filled with was the ocean water. That was the arithmetic, and it was Wilma's job, and it nearly went wrong. The drum in the hold had, we estimated, around 100 litres. 4 boys in equatorial sun in an open boat with almost no shade, ni if they are doing nothing at all, perhaps 2.5 litres each per day to stay properly hydrated. That is 10 litres a day. 10 days of water. Wilma put us on 1 litre and a bit each per day from the 4th day, which was hard, and then on less than 1 litre from the 2nd week, which was very hard, and we still finished that drum on the 21st day. Everything after that was rain. And here is where we got lucky in a way that had nothing to do with us. We were drifting west and slightly north into the equatorial Pacific in March, into the band where the trade winds of the 2 hemispheres run into each other and the air rises and it rains. Not every day, but often and heavily. If we had drifted a few hundred miles south, into the dry belt off Peru, we would not have survived the 5th week. We did not choose that. The current chose it. The tarpaulin was our whole life after day 21. It was an old grey thing, torn in one corner, that had been folded in the bottom of the hold for years, and we washed it in the sea and then rinsed it 4 times in the first rain we caught, and then it became a machine. We learned it fast because we had to. We rigged it over the hold with the corners lashed to the rail, and one corner low and a hole cut in that corner, so that everything that hit that tarpaulin ran to one point and dripped into the drum. Everything stopped for rain. Everything. There was no job on that boat more important, and by the 4th week all 4 of us could have the whole thing set up in under 2 minutes, and Segundo used to run drills, which we all mocked him for, and which meant that when the big one came at 3 in the morning in the 6th week, we filled the drum and both buckets and the pot in about 40 minutes in complete darkness. The first water off it is salty, and you throw it away. We learned that on the first attempt by tasting it and spitting it out. After that we had a rule. 2 minutes of rain goes over the side, then we collect, and you drink as much as you physically can while it is raining, because your own body is a container. We would lie in the rain with our mouths open and pour cups into each other, and it is one of the few purely joyful things that happened out there. There is a photograph in my head that does not exist anywhere else. Tito, 16 years old, soaking wet, standing in the stern of that boat in a downpour at 4 in the afternoon with his arms out and his head back, shouting, "Now the food." The first 10 days were bananas and bread and biscuits and limes, rationed, and by the 11th day there was nothing. And we had a cast net and 2 hand lines and no bait, and the ocean under us was empty. I want to explain what that means, because I did not understand it at all at 17. We were in blue water, real blue water, and it looked to me like it should be full of fish, and it was empty. Nothing. 10 days of putting a line over and getting nothing, not one bite, and I took it personally because fishing was my job. And then the boat became an island. That is the only way I have ever been able to describe it. Around the 12th or 13th day, I put my head over the side to look at the hull, and I could not believe what I was seeing. The bottom of that boat had gone green and then brown, and it was starting to grow a beard, a fur of weed, and then, within days, gooseneck barnacles, hundreds of them, with white shells and rubbery stalks, waving, and with the growth came the little fish. First a scatter of tiny striped ones that hid in the shadow of the hull, then more. Then, by the 3rd week, there was a whole crowd down there, and by the 4th week, there were fish under that boat of a size worth catching, and bigger ones out at the edge of the shade that came in fast and went out again. I learned to catch them with my hands, and it took me a week to work out. The little fish that live under a floating object are not afraid of it. They treat it as home, and they will let a hand hang in the water a long time before they decide anything about it. You lie on the gunwale with your arm in up to the shoulder, completely still, for 5 or 10 minutes, and they come back, and then you take one. By the 5th week, I could get 8 or 9 a day, and Tito, who had smaller hands and more patience than anybody expected, got better than me. The cast net we used over the shoal that formed under us at dawn, and about 1 throw in 5 was worth the effort, and the flying fish came for free, at night, which is the great mercy of that ocean. They travel in the dark and they are drawn to anything pale, and our boat was white, and there was a rattle and a slap on the deck several nights a week, and there would be food in the morning that had delivered itself. The gas ran out on the 19th day, and I have never forgotten the sound of that little bottle going hollow when Segundo shook it. For 19 days we had cooked. That is a thing almost nobody in these stories gets to say. We had a single gas ring and a pot, and we boiled fish, and we made a broth with limes in it, and it was hot, and it tasted of something, and for 19 days we ate like people. And then it was gone, and after that everything was raw for 30 days. That was the worst morale day of the entire drift, and it was not caused by hunger or thirst or fear. It was caused by the end of hot food. Tito cried about it, which he was ashamed of, and Wilma told him, and this was exactly right, that anybody who did not cry about that was not paying attention. We saw 11 ships in 49 days, and not one of them saw us. I have the count exactly because Tito kept it, scratched on the wheelhouse door under the water rotor. 11. 2 at night, as lights, hull down and far off. 9 in daylight, of which perhaps 4 were close enough that we could see the color of them. The closest was on the 28th day, and I still dream about that one. A container ship going south. I would say now that she passed at 3 miles, and at the time I would have sworn she was 1. We could see the stacks of boxes and the red and black of her hull. We had no flares. No boat on that beach carried flares. What we had was a tarpaulin and 4 voices and a piece of tin. We waved. We shouted for 20 minutes. Segundo climbed onto the wheelhouse roof, which we all told him not to do, and stood up there swinging his shirt, and I flashed the sun off the galvanized lid of the toolbox for as long as she was in view. She did not alter by 1 degree. That evening was the closest we came to breaking. Not physically, we were still in reasonable shape at 4 weeks, but as a group. Somebody said something and somebody answered it, and within about a minute, Wilma and Segundo were standing up in the stern of that boat with their hands on each other, and Tito was screaming at both of them. And I was sitting on the hold hatch with my hands over my ears like a child. It was about nothing. It was about who had eaten the last of something 4 days earlier. It was, of course, not about that at all. And the next morning Wilma instituted the last piece of our government, and it is the piece I have thought about most in the 27 years since. He called it the talking. What it was a court. The rule was this: once a day, in the evening, after the food and before the home talk, anybody could say one thing that had been bothering him out loud to the person it was about, in front of everybody, and the person had to listen and was allowed to answer once. And then it was finished, and nobody was allowed to bring it up again, ever. That is it. That is the whole system. 4 teenage boys in an open boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean invented a grievance procedure, and it worked, and we used it every single evening for the last 3 weeks, and after we started using it, we never had another fight. I have described that arrangement to a marriage counselor at a party about 12 years ago, and she put her drink down. What it did was to stop things accumulating. In a small space with no privacy and no escape, everything accumulates. The way Segundo breathed, the way Tito hummed, the way I always took the shady seat 1 minute early, every one of those things is nothing, and every one of them, over 40 days, becomes something. And if it has nowhere to go, it comes out sideways in a fight about biscuits. Some of the things said in that court were brutal. Wilma once told me, in front of the other two, that I acted like the whole thing was happening to somebody else, and that it made him want to hit me. That was true, and I did not know it about myself until that moment, and I have thought about it my whole adult life. And every time, the next morning, we started clean. Now, the part I actually want to tell you, which is the part nobody asks about, it was beautiful. I have never been able to make anybody from outside understand that both things are true, that I was starving and burnt and frightened and 17, and that those 49 days contained the most extraordinary things I have ever seen. I had grown up on that coast. I had been on the water my whole life, and I had never once looked at the ocean, because the ocean was where the work was, and you look at your work the way a farmer looks at a field. For 49 days I had nothing to do but look. There was a whale shark on the 31st day. She came up beside us in the afternoon, 8 meters, nearly as long as our boat, and stayed for most of 2 hours, spotted, slow, that huge flat head, feeding on something we could not see, completely uninterested in 4 boys hanging over the rail with our mouths open. Tito got in the water. We all shouted at him and he went anyway, and he swam alongside that animal for perhaps a minute, and then he got out and sat on the deck and did not say a word for an hour, which for Tito was unprecedented. There were birds constantly, more days than not. Boobies that landed on our rail and looked at us with no fear at all. Frigate birds that hung above us for whole afternoons without a wing beat. Once, on about the 40th day, we came through a place where the sea was boiling, a bait ball, tuna underneath driving it up, and above it a column of birds that must have been 1,000 birds, going down into the water like thrown stones, and the noise of it carried a mile. There was a sailfish that stayed with the boat for a whole morning and lit up in bars of electric blue when it turned, which I have since learned they do when they are hunting, and which was, at the time, simply the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. And there were the nights. There is no light out there. I want to be precise about that because most people have never experienced it. No towns, no ships, no aircraft, nothing on any horizon in any direction, and on the nights with no moon what happens is that the sky stops being a black surface with dots on it and becomes a depth. You can see that some stars are nearer than others. The Milky Way comes up out of the water like smoke and goes right over the top of you, and it turns all night, and by the 4th week I could tell roughly what time it was by looking at it. And the water lit up. Not every night, maybe 15 or 20 of the 49, but when it did, it was cold green fire, and every fish moving under the boat became a comet, and when you put your hand in the water it burned. We used it. That is the part that pleases me most. We used it practically. On those nights you could see where the fish were under the hull because they left tracks, and I caught fish at night, by hand, by the light that the fish themselves made in the water. Around the 40th day we were, by any measure, in trouble. All 4 of us had salt sores on our hips and elbows that would not close. Tito had stopped producing much urine, and what there was dark, and that frightened me more than anything else in 7 weeks. My gums had gone soft and one of my back teeth moved when I pushed it. We had all lost, I found out later, between 11 and 16 kilos each, out of bodies that had not carried much to begin with, and Wilma had begun to be strange, not sick, quiet. He had carried all 4 of us for 6 weeks. He had made every decision, poured every cup, taken the responsibility for a boat that was his uncle's, and a disaster that he believed, correctly or not, was his fault. And around the 40th day he simply started to go somewhere else. What brought him back was Tito, who was 16, and who I do not think planned it. Tito started asking him for permission for things. Stupid things. Can I fish now? Can I move to the shade early? Should we bail? Things Tito had been doing without asking for a month. He did it for 3 days, and by the end of the 3rd day Wilma was running the boat again. I asked Tito about that in 2011 at Segundo's wedding, and he did not remember doing it. He genuinely did not remember. He said he had just been scared and had wanted somebody to be in charge. They found us on the 49th day, in the middle of the morning, and the way it happened is the part that has haunted me most and that I have spent a lot of my life since trying to understand. There was a research vessel, a big American oceanographic ship, white, about 80 meters, with a crane on the back deck and instruments all over her. She was on a passage to service a line of moored buoys along the equator, part of a system that measures ocean temperature and wind out there in the middle of nowhere, which is a thing I did not know existed, and which I now teach to 15-year-olds every year. She had a planned track, and we were not on it. 2 days before, There had been a weather system building to the west of her intended route, and her master had altered course to the north to stay out of it, and that alteration put her across a piece of ocean she had no reason to be in. An ordinary seaman on the bridge wing saw something at about 2 miles that he thought was a log. He said afterwards, "This came out over a couple of days on that ship, through the cook, in pieces, that he had almost not mentioned it." That is the sentence. He had almost not mentioned it, because there is a lot of stuff floating in the ocean, and a bridge watch does not report every log, and because they were 3 days from anywhere and running behind, and because it was almost certainly nothing. He mentioned it. Somebody put binoculars on it, and there was a wooden hull, hove down at the stern, growing weed a foot thick along her waterline, with a grey tarpaulin rigged over the hold and 4 figures on her. We had not seen the ship. That is the thing I cannot get over even now. Tito was on watch, and he had done his circle at the hour and had seen nothing, and she came up in the gap. We heard her before we saw her. All 4 of us were sitting under the tarpaulin, and there was a sound that was not the sea, and Segundo stood up so fast he put his head through the tarp, and she was already turning. That is what I remember. When we finally looked, that ship was already coming around toward us, which means somebody had already decided, and I have never in my life felt anything like the sound the 4 of us made. They put a small boat in the water, and it came across with 4 men in orange life jackets, and one of them was filming, which annoyed me at the time, and which I am now glad about, because that film exists and my mother has watched it perhaps 200 times. We could not stand up. All 4 of us tried, and none of us managed it properly, and I remember being embarrassed, which is a ridiculous thing to feel, and which is apparently very common. They took us aboard on a stretcher one at a time, and it was, I am told, done extremely carefully, because they had a doctor aboard who knew that a badly dehydrated person hauled upright too fast can arrest, and who had made everybody go slowly. They gave us water in small cups, and made us wait, and then a little more. Their cook, from Panama, the only person aboard who spoke Spanish, sat with us the whole first day and did nothing else, and I have never learned his full name, and I have looked. And on the second day, when we could sit up, the captain came down to see us. He was about 60 grey, in a work shirt, and he did not look like a captain to me at all. He sat on a stool in that little sick bay with the cook beside him and looked at the 4 of us for a while, with our sores dressed and our lips split, and then he said something to the cook, and the cook translated it, and it was not a question. He said, "I am sorry. We should have found you a long time ago, that is all." He apologized. He had no reason to. He had nothing to do with it. He was a man on a ship that had altered course to avoid weather, and the only reason he was in that piece of ocean was an accident of meteorology, and he had personally saved our lives about 18 hours earlier. And what he said, first before anything else, was that he was sorry that the world had taken 49 days. I was 17, and I did not understand it. I understood it about 10 years later, and it made me put my head down on a table in my own kitchen. He was apologizing on behalf of everybody. On behalf of the arrangement, the fact that 4 boys from a beach town could disappear 4 miles off their own coast, and nobody would know for a day and a half, and after that nobody would have any idea where to look, and the search that eventually went out would look inshore and south, because that is where sense says to look, while an offshore wind and a current nobody in our town had ever put a name to carried us west at 25 miles a day into a piece of ocean where there is nothing at all. They searched for us for 6 days. From the 5th day, the Navy sent an aircraft twice. Boats from our town and the town to the south went out for a week, on their own fuel, which is a thing I have never been able to repay, and which is the reason I have never left. By the time that search started, we were already 300 miles outside it. We had drifted, in the end, a little over 1,100 nautical miles. Wilmer had kept account of the days with a nail, and he was out by 1 at the end, which the Americans found remarkable, and which he was annoyed about. We spent 3 weeks in a hospital in Guayaquil. There were journalists, and for about a month the 4 of us were the most famous teenagers in the country, and this was the second worst thing that happened to us. Tito, who was 16, gave an interview in which he said something about Wilmer taking the boat, and it was edited, and it caused 2 years of trouble between 2 families in a town of 3,000 people. Everything is all right now. But it took a long time, and the drift was easier than the year afterwards, and I have heard the same thing from other people who have come back from things. Segundo is a fisherman. He has his own boat, a good one, 12 meters, with a life raft and 2 radios and an EPRB in a bracket by the wheel, and he will not go out with a man who is careless about any of it, and his crews find him unbearable on the subject. Tito lives in Spain, in Valencia, and works in construction and has 3 children, and he comes home every 2nd year. He does not talk about it at all, not to anybody. That is his right. Wilmer got his boat. It took him 11 years. Don Aurelio, who lost a boat and never once said a word against his nephew in public, went guarantor on the loan, and I went back to school. That was the strange one. I was 17 and had been an average student who was going to go fishing, and I went back to that school and finished, and then I went to Porto Viejo to study, and then I came back and started teaching, and I have taught in that town for 19 years. I teach natural science to 15-year-olds, and every year, in the section on the oceans, I do one lesson that is not really on the curriculum. I put up a map of the Pacific and show them the currents, the big wheel of them, the way the water in this ocean is not sitting still but moving, all the time, in enormous slow rivers that have been running since before anybody was here to name them. I show them the buoys, the ones that ship was going to service, and I explain that there are instruments out there, in the middle of nothing, measuring the sea every hour of every day, and telling us what the weather will do in a year's time. And then I tell them that 4 boys from this town went out one morning and were carried 1,100 miles by that machinery without ever once feeling it move. They always ask the same question. They ask if I was scared of the sea afterwards, and the answer is no, and it has taken me most of my life to be able to explain why. Nothing out there was against us. Not one thing. The wind that took us off that coast blows every evening in that season, and it has blown that way for as long as there has been a coast, and it would have blown exactly the same on a night when nobody was on the water. The current did not choose us. It did not know we were on it. Those 11 ships were not ignoring us. A 9-meter wooden hull in the trough of a swell is invisible at 3 miles, and every man on every one of those bridges was doing his job properly. There was no punishment in any of it, and there was no mercy either. And inside all of that indifference, this is what happened. It rained. The bottom of our boat grew a garden, and the garden brought fish, and the fish fed 4 boys for a month. Flying fish threw themselves onto our deck in the dark. A whale shark 8 meters long came and looked at us, and let a 16-year-old swim beside her. The sea lit itself green so many nights that we started to use it as a lamp, and an American ship went 100 miles out of her way to avoid a storm, and a seaman on her bridge wing almost did not mention a log. None of it was for us. That is the whole thing. That is what I want the 15-year-olds to have, and I do not know whether any of them take it. But this is what I keep, and it is not about the ocean at all. 4 boys, aged 16 to 19, from a town with 1 road, with no adult and no plan and no map, and nothing but a broken boat and each other, sat down in the middle of the largest empty space on this planet and built a set of rules so that nobody would be treated worse than anybody else, and so that grievances could not accumulate, and so that hope was rationed like water, and so that home was something we visited together after dark, instead of something that ambushed us alone in the afternoon. Nobody taught us that. It came out of arguments between children, and when I am tired, or when the school is being run badly, or when I read the news, I think about the fact that it is possible, that it has been done, that I watched it done by a 19-year-old fisherman with a nail and a wheelhouse door, and it makes me feel better about very nearly everything. The crossing was 38 kilometers, and I had done it twice before, and I want to start with that, because it is the whole shape of what happened. I was not a novice. I was not under-equipped in any way that a reasonable person would notice. I had 21 years in a sea kayak, and I had crossed to that island in 2011 and again in 2015, both times in worse weather than I had on the morning I did not get there. A kayak is a very fast boat and a very poor raft. That is the sentence I have ended up using when people ask me how it was possible, and it is the technical heart of it. Everything about the design of a sea kayak assumes that you are going somewhere. 17 feet long, 18 inches wide at the beam, 3 watertight compartments, and a cockpit that fits you like a shoe. It will carry you 100 kilometers in a day if you are strong and the tide is with you, and it will not let you lie down, or stand up, or get out of the wind, or sleep properly, or move your legs more than about 4 inches, and it will not keep you alive by itself for 1 single hour. It is a bicycle, not a shelter. I was in mine for 6 days. I am 48 now. I was 41 then. I work as a physiotherapist in Galway, and I have paddled since I was 20, first in white water and then, after a shoulder injury that put an end to that, on the sea, which turned out to be the thing I had actually been looking for the whole time. I want to explain what sea kayaking is before I explain what went wrong, because most people picture something recreational, and it is not that at all. It is closer to mountaineering than to boating. You are not on the water in a kayak, you are in it. Your backside is below the waterline. Waves break over your chest. You are wearing the boat. A spray deck seals the cockpit around your ribs, and when a swell lifts you, you feel it start under your legs. On a calm day, you can look down through the surface beside your own hip and see 40 feet of water and the light going down into it, and you can hear things. A gannet hitting the sea 200 meters off, the fizz of a wave collapsing behind you, the actual physical hiss of your own bow. That intimacy is why people do it, and it is also, as I found out, the thing that changes the entire character of being lost out there. But I will come to that. The west coast of Ireland is the best sea kayaking coast in Europe, and it is not gentle. The Atlantic hits it with the accumulated swell of 3,000 kilometers of nothing, and there are tidal streams that run through the gaps between the islands like rivers. The tide on that coast is the whole game. On a spring tide, the range can be 4 meters, and all that water has to move twice a day, and where it has to squeeze past a headland, it accelerates, and where an accelerated stream meets a swell running the other way, the sea stands up and behaves like a rapid, standing waves, boils, whirlpools 2 meters across that you can hear from a kilometer away. We call those tide races, and they are, in the right conditions, the most exhilarating thing in the sport. Kayakers travel across the world to surf them. And they are also the reason I spent 6 days in the North Atlantic. The island is 38 kilometers off the Mayo coast, and I am not going to name it, because there are 90 people living on it, and they have been extremely kind to me, and they would not want their home to be the place in this story. It sits with its long axis roughly north-south, and off the southern tip there is a shallow bank, and on a big ebb the stream comes down the outside of the island and over that bank, and it runs at 4 knots and sometimes more. 4 knots does not sound like much. A fit sea kayaker cruises at 4.5. That is the arithmetic that catches people out, and it caught me, and I knew all of it in advance. I have taught it. I have stood in front of a room of paddlers with a chart and a whiteboard and explained exactly the thing that then happened to me, which is a fact about my life that I have had to make peace with. The plan was correct. I had it written on a laminated card taped to my foredeck. Launch at Euro 640 to catch the last of the flood. Cross the first 20 kilometers with the stream setting me north. Hit slack water at the halfway mark, and come in on the southern end of the island as the ebb began, ferry gliding against it so that the tides push and my paddling would cancel out, and I would go where I was pointing. Ferry gliding is the thing every kayaker learns first, and it is genuinely beautiful. You do not aim at where you are going. You aim upstream of it, at an angle, and let the current carry you sideways while you paddle forwards. And if you get the angle right, you cross a moving river in a straight line. On a crossing like that, you hold the angle by watching a transit. 2 fixed points on the land lined up, one behind the other, and as long as they stay lined up, you are holding your track. It is a completely analog, 1,000-year-old technique, and it works perfectly. I launched at 07:22, 42 minutes late. I want to be honest about the reason, because it was not weather, and it was not equipment failure. It was that the strap on my rudder line had perished, and I noticed it while loading and decided to replace it. And I did not have the right cord, so I cut a length off a bit of spare deckline and rigged it, and it took about 20 minutes, and it was the right thing to do. And then, when I was in the car park at the pier, a gravel pull-in at the end of a boreen with room for 4 cars, my sister rang, and I took the call because you take the call from your sister, and it lasted 11 minutes, 42 minutes, on a spring tide, on a 38-kilometer crossing, is not a delay. It is a different plan because the tide does not wait, and every minute I was late meant I arrived at the island later in the ebb, and the ebb builds. If I had arrived at slack, or in the first hour, I would have crossed the bank without much noticing it, arriving 2 hours into a spring ebb, into water that had been accelerating for 2 hours, with a southeasterly that had come in fresher than forecast and was blowing against the direction of the stream. That is a completely different piece of sea, and I knew, at about the halfway point, that I was late. I checked my watch and I did the sum, and I remember exactly what I thought, which was, it will be lively at the end, lively. That was my assessment. I have thought about that word many times. The first 4 hours were superb. I want to say that, because if I only describe the disaster, I am lying by omission. There was a 2-meter swell out of the west with about a 9-second period, long and easy, and I was riding up and over it with the sun coming behind my left shoulder, and after 2 hours I stopped and rafted up against my own paddle float to eat a bar and drink, and I was completely happy in the way that I have only ever been in a boat that small in water that big. There were gannets working about a kilometer north. 20 or 30 of them, going down into the sea like thrown stones, that hard white folding dive they do from 30 meters up. And there were full Mars all morning, gliding stiff-winged along the swell faces without a wing beat, coming past me at eye level, which is a thing that only happens in a kayak because you are at eye level with a bird 6 inches off the water. At about 11 the island was properly up. Green, with a hill at the northern end, and the white of houses along the harbour, and I could see the ferry pier. I could see a car moving on the road above the harbour. I want you to understand how close that is. I was 3 or 4 kilometers off, and I could see a red car, and then the water changed. It happened over about 10 minutes, and I felt it before I understood it. The swell stopped being long and easy and started to shorten and steepen, and the surface between the swells went from smooth to a kind of nervous, textured confusion, and then there was a noise. That is the thing about a tide race. You hear it. A low continuous rumble and hiss off to the south of me, like a motorway a field away, and the water in front of me had a line across it, a seam of foam and disturbed surface running out from the southern tip of that island for 2 kilometers. I checked my transit, the shoulder of the hill against a notch behind it, and it was moving, not slowly. It was walking across, right to left, which meant I was going south fast, so I did what I had been trained to do and what I had trained other people to do. I turned up tide, put my bow about 40 degrees off my desired track, and I paddled. I paddled at full effort, not cruising, racing, for 2 hours and 11 minutes. There is a specific kind of despair in that, and I have never been able to make anybody understand it who has not experienced it. Everything is working. My technique was good, my boat was fast, I was strong, and I was 41, and I was in the best physical condition of my adult life, and I could look at the land and watch it moving the wrong way past me, and there was nothing I could do about it, because the piece of water I was sitting in was going south at 4.5 knots, and I could paddle at 4.5 knots, and 4.5 minus 4.5 is 0, and the wind was against me on top of that. At one point I got a transit to hold for maybe 20 minutes, and I thought I had won. Then the stream tightened, and the transit started moving again, faster than before. At about 1:30 in the afternoon, the southern tip of the island was abeam of me, perhaps 2.5 kilometers away, and I understood that I was not going to reach it. At about 3 it was behind me. I have been asked why I did not turn around and go back to the mainland with the tide. It is the right question. The answer is that by then the wind had come up to about 18 knots from the southeast, which put it directly on my nose for the mainland, and the mainland was 22 kilometers upwind, and I had already spent everything I had. A sea kayak, against 18 knots, makes about 2 knots over the ground if the paddler is fresh. I was not fresh. I had done 30 kilometers and then raced for 2 hours, and it was March, and I had about 4 hours of daylight left, and if I had started for the mainland, I would have been out there in the dark, in a rising wind with nothing left, which is how people die. So I made the only good decision of that entire day, and I made it at about 3:30 in the afternoon. Sitting in the middle of the ocean watching an island I could see perfectly well get smaller, I stopped trying to get anywhere, and I started trying to last. Here is what I had, and I have had a lot of time to think about this list. I had my boat, which was intact. I had a 2-piece carbon paddle and a spare split paddle on the foredeck. I had a dry suit, which is the single reason I am alive and which I will come back to. I had a buoyancy aid with a whistle, a knife, a compass, and a chest pocket. I had my spray deck, a neoprene one with a bungee rim, which became the most useful object I have ever owned. 3 liters of water in 2 bladders, food for 3 days if I was careful. Bars, nuts, 2 packets of oat cakes, a block of cheese, 4 bananas, a bag of dried apricots, a head torch, a small first aid kit, and a water filter, which was a very good filter, and which was completely useless because there was nothing to filter. I have laughed about that many times since. I was carrying, for 6 days, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a device for making fresh water safe to drink. In the rear hatch, a bivy bag, a spare fleece, a hat, a repair kit, and a bag of tent pegs, which is what happens when you pack for an island camp. I had a VHF radio in my buoyancy aid pocket, and I used it. On the first evening, I put out a call every 20 minutes for 2 hours. Handheld VHF from the cockpit of a kayak is line of sight from an aerial about a meter above the water, which gives you a range of perhaps 5 or 6 kilometers to another small boat, and maybe 15 to a coast station on a very good day. By the time I gave up, I was already too far south and west, and the wind was on the shore, and there was nobody out. I kept it and used it twice a day, at dawn and dusk, until the battery died on the 4th morning. What I did not have was my beacon. I own a personal locator beacon. I have owned one since 2009. It is a small orange thing that clips to a buoyancy aid, and if you hold the button down, it talks to a satellite, and gives your position to within about 100 meters, and a rescue helicopter will be over you in 90 minutes, almost anywhere in Irish waters. That morning, because I had been traveling and had taken a smaller bag for the drive, I had transferred my gear between 2 buoyancy aids the night before. The beacon was in the pocket of the other one. It was in the boot of my car, in a gravel pull-in at the end of a boreen, for the entire 6 days. I do not have anything interesting to say about that. It is the whole of what I did wrong, and it is the reason a 6-hour problem became a 6-day one. And every time I tell this to a group of paddlers, I say it in exactly those words, and then I stop talking for a moment, and it is the most useful 2 seconds of the entire talk. Now the 6 days, the first thing I had to solve was the thing that kills solo paddlers, which is that a sea kayak is not stable enough to sleep in and you cannot get out of it. I want to be clear about how bad that problem is. A loaded sea kayak in a 2-meter swell requires continuous small corrections from the person in it. Not paddling, just presence, a hip, an occasional low brace. If you fall asleep sitting up in a kayak, you capsize within a few minutes, and if you capsize you are in 14-degree water in the dark, wet inside your dry suit, with a boat full of water, alone. Nobody survives that twice. The solution took me most of the first evening to work out, and I got it from 2 separate techniques I already knew. The first was the paddle float outrigger. A paddle float is an inflatable bag that you slide over one paddle blade to make a temporary outrigger for self-rescue. I inflated mine, put it on one blade, and lashed the paddle shaft across the back deck behind the cockpit, hard, with my deck lines and a length of the cord I had cut that morning for the rudder strap. That gave me an outrigger about a meter out on one side. With it rigged, that boat would sit at rest in a moderate sea and lean against the float, and it would not go over. It was not comfortable. It was a machine for not drowning while unconscious, and it worked for 6 nights. The second was the sea anchor, and this one I am proud of. A boat lying beam on to a swell rolls and slaps and gets tiring and wet. A boat held bow on rides it. So on the first night I took my spare spray deck. I carry 2, which nobody does, and I carry 2 because I split one on a rock in 2013 and have been superstitious ever since. And I cut a hole in the center with my knife, made a bridle from cord through the bungee rim, and streamed it off the bow on about 8 meters of line. A drogue made out of a neoprene spray deck. It filled with water and hung down, and it held my bow within about 30 degrees of the swell for 6 days, and it slowed my drift, and I still have it, in the shed, with the hole in it. So that was the shape of every one of those days, and it did not vary. I paddled at dawn, and I paddled at dusk. 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, in the cool, when the wind was usually at its lightest, and I paddled southeast on the compass in the direction of the mainland, even though I knew perfectly well that I was making net progress in the other direction. That is the part that people find strange, and it is the part that kept me sane. I was not paddling to arrive anywhere. I was paddling because a person who is still doing her job is a different person than a person waiting to be found, and because 4 hours a day of hard physical work made me warm and made me tired and gave the day a shape with a beginning and an end. And in between, from about 10 in the morning until about 6 in the evening, and then all night, I lay to that spray deck drogue with the outrigger rigged and did nothing at all. That is where the 6 days actually happened. Not in the paddling, in the lying there. Water was the crisis, and I got extremely lucky, in the sense that I was in Ireland in March, which is a place and a season that solves that problem for you if you are set up to receive it. I had 3 liters. I made them last 4 days by rationing to about 700 milliliters a day, which is not enough and which I could get away with because it was 14 degrees and I was not sweating in the way you would in the tropics. It rained on 4 of the 6 days. And I had a bivy bag, which is a big orange waterproof sack, and it is the perfect rain catchment. You spread it across the deck in front of the cockpit with a hollow in the middle and hold 2 corners and let it fill. The first flush is salt off the fabric and you throw that away. After that it is clean, and I drank straight from the hollow and then filled both bladders and, on the 5th day, my dry bag, which I lashed upright between my knees like a bottle. On the 5th night there was a squall that gave me, I would guess, 3 liters in 20 minutes, and I lay in the cockpit with the bag over my head and drank until I was uncomfortable, and then laughed out loud. Alone, in the dark, in the middle of the North Atlantic, food was simpler because there was nothing to be done about it. I had 3 days of food and I stretched it to 4.5, and then there was nothing at all. I had no fishing gear. Kayakers do not carry fishing gear on a day crossing, and I caught nothing and I did not seriously try. That is one thing my story does not have. There was no drama of fish. I was simply hungry for the last 2 days, and hunger, it turns out, is far less interesting than everybody thinks. It becomes a background noise. By the 6th day I had stopped noticing it much and had started noticing, instead, that my hands were shaking and that I could not do arithmetic. I did eat one thing and I remember it as a great triumph. On the 3rd afternoon a fishing float went past. One of those hard plastic ones, orange, about the size of a football, lost off somebody's gear, and I paddled 100 meters to get it, and when I hauled it out of the water the underside of it was covered in goose barnacles. 2 or 3 dozen of them, on rubbery stalks with hard white shells, the things that grow on anything that floats in the open ocean for long enough. I ate them raw, over about half an hour, sitting in the cockpit with the float on my spray deck. They are salty and rubbery, and taste faintly of something between mussel and mushroom, and they were the only calories I had after the 4th day, and I have thought about that float ever since, because it had been out there long enough to grow a colony, and it had done nothing whatsoever except drift, and it had come to me. The cold was the thing that would have killed me, and the reason it did not is my dry suit. A dry suit is a fully sealed garment with latex seals at the neck and wrists and integral socks, and you wear thermals under it, and the point of it is that you can be in the water indefinitely and stay dry. Mine was a good one, a 4-layer, and it was less than 2 years old, and its seals were sound. I did not take it off for 6 days. Not once. Even so, the nights were very bad. It was March. The air was going down to 7 or 8 degrees, the wind never stopped, and I was sitting almost immobile in a boat with my legs under a deck for 14 hours of darkness. You cannot generate heat sitting still. I shivered. In bouts, most of every night. I put the spare fleece on over the dry suit, which is the wrong way round and which helped anyway because it broke the wind. I put the bivy bag over my head and shoulders and tucked it under the spray deck rim, so that I was in a sort of orange tent from the waist up, and that made an enormous difference, and it is the single best thing I did. By the 4th day, I had lost the feeling in 3 toes. By the 6th, my feet inside those dry suit socks had gone white and wrinkled and soft, which is immersion foot, and I could not walk for 9 days afterwards. And I could not move. That is the specific misery of a kayak that no raft survivor has to deal with. 6 days in one seated position with my legs in a tube. I could not straighten them. I could not turn over. I could not stand. I got a pressure sore on my tailbone that took 5 weeks to heal, and my hip flexors seized so badly by the 5th day that when the crew of the patrol vessel eventually lifted me out, my legs would not unbend, and 2 men had to straighten them for me while I made a noise I am not proud of. Now I want to tell you the other half of it, because everything I have described so far is logistics, and logistics is not what those 6 days were. I said at the start that in a kayak you are not on the ocean, you are in it. For 6 days I was inside the North Atlantic at eye level with nothing to do but look, and what I saw has changed how I understand the sea, and I had been going to sea for 21 years before it happened. The first thing is the swell. From a ship, or from a headland, the ocean looks like a surface with texture on it. From a kayak, lying to a drogue with your chin about 40 centimeters above the water, it is a landscape. You are in a valley. The swell around me was 2 to 3 meters for most of those 6 days, which means that when I was in a trough I could see nothing at all except 2 long walls of grey-green water, one in front and one behind, higher than my head, moving. And then I would rise, not fast, not violently, just an enormous slow lift under my legs. And for perhaps 4 seconds I would be on top of a hill and could see for miles across a whole moving country of them, ranks of hills going away in every direction to the horizon, and then I would go down again. That happens every 9 or 10 seconds, 12,000 times a day. I stopped being frightened of it on about the 2nd day and started, in a way I cannot fully justify, to enjoy it, and you learn to read it. By the 3rd day, I could tell you what the wind had been doing 400 kilometers away, because a swell carries the fingerprint of the storm that made it. The period between crests tells you how far it has traveled and how big the system was. There was a long low set that came in on the 4th day from the northwest, 11 or 12 seconds between crests, which meant something serious had happened a very long way off, and I did not need a forecast to know that I would be paying for it in about 36 hours, and I was. The birds were constant, and they were the best company I have ever had. Fulmars all day, every day. They come and look at you. A fulmar will fly a slow circuit of a kayak at 15 meters, 3 or 4 times, on stiff wings, and then go on. And they did that so often that I began talking to them out loud by the 2nd day. There were storm petrels on the 4th and 5th evenings, tiny things the size of a swallow, fluttering and dipping their feet on the surface in the last of the light, hundreds of kilometers from any land, which is where they live. They only come ashore to breed, and they do it at night. There were gannets. Twice I had a gannet dive within 30 meters of my boat, and I heard it hit, that hard percussive crack, and saw the white column of bubbles. On the 3rd morning a basking shark went past. I heard it before I saw it, which is the strangest part. There was a wet, soft, enormous exhalation-ish noise off to my left, which was not a whale and which I could not place, and then a dorsal fin came up about 20 meters away, and it was the height of my forearm, and it was moving very slowly, and behind it, ridiculously far behind it, the tail. That animal was longer than my boat by half again. Basking sharks feed at the surface on plankton with their mouths open, and they are utterly harmless, and they are the 2nd largest fish in the world. And there is one that swam past a woman sitting in a plastic boat 18 inches wide, off the west of Ireland, and put its fin up and did not look at me, and went on about its business. I laughed. That is what I did. I sat in the cockpit and laughed for about a minute. There was a sunfish on the 5th day, one of those absurd flat grey discs, lying on its side at the surface with one fin waving in the air, which is what they do to let seabirds pick parasites off them, and it let me come within a paddle's length before it turned over and went down. And on the 4th night there were the pilot whales, and that is the thing I actually came here to tell. It was after midnight, and there was no moon, and the wind had dropped almost to nothing, which had happened only once before in those 6 days. I was lying to the drogue with the bivy bag over my head and shoulders, and I was not asleep, because I never really slept. I only went somewhere shallower than waking for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, and I heard a breath, not a splash. A breath, a sharp, wet, explosive exhalation, and then, immediately, the intake. And it was very close, and it was on my right, and I could not see anything at all. Then another, further off. Then 2 together. Then one so close that I felt the spray land on the bivy bag over my head. They were long-finned pilot whales. I am confident of that from the sound, from the season, from the water I was in, and from the fact that they stayed. They are extremely social animals. They travel in family groups of 10 to 50, and they stay together their whole lives. And they were all around me for about an hour. I could not see one of them, not one. There was no moon and no bioluminescence that night, and the sea was black and the sky was black, and there was nothing to see. I sat in that cockpit in the dark for an hour, listening to somewhere between 15 and 30 enormous animals breathing around me in a circle at distances between about 3 meters and 200, and every so often the low whistle and click of one of them talking underwater, which comes up through the hull of a kayak, into your body rather than into your ears. I was, by then, on my 4th day with no beacon and no radio and no contact and no food to speak of, and what I felt was not fear. I have gone over this many times, honestly, and I am sure of it. What I felt was that I had been included in something. I said something to them, out loud. I am not going to write what it was. And then, over about 10 minutes, the breathing got further away, and there was one last one somewhere off to the south, and then there was nothing but the drogue line creaking and the water going past. That hour is the single most extraordinary thing that has happened in my life, and I have had a reasonably eventful one. I have thought about it nearly every week for 7 years. I did not see them. That is the part that I cannot get past. If I had seen them, it would have been a wildlife encounter. Because I could not see them, it was something else. It was an hour of being in the presence of a large number of intelligent animals in total darkness, on their terms, with absolutely no ability to observe them, which is much closer to the truth of what the ocean is than anything I have ever experienced with a mask on. The 5th day was the bad one, and I am going to be honest about it. I had been out 5 days. My food was gone. My radio was dead. I had lost feeling in my toes and my hands were shaking and I could not do sums. I tried to work out my drift and I could not hold the numbers. I had done the arithmetic on the 1st day and knew that nobody would report me missing before the 6th day at the very earliest, because I had told one friend I might do the crossing this week, and she was in Spain, and my car was in a place where a car could sit for a fortnight without anybody thinking anything of it. And at some point on that 5th afternoon, I stopped doing the drill. I did not paddle at dusk. I did not check the drogue bridle. I lay there in the bivy bag with the outrigger on and I let the afternoon go past, and I remember thinking, with total clarity, that I could simply keep doing that. What got me up was the swell. Around 6 in the evening, I noticed that the period had shortened and that the wind had backed, and I lay there and watched 2 or 3 sets go under me, and understood, with the professional part of my brain, which had not gone anywhere, that I had weather coming in about 12 hours, and that my drogue bridle had chafed through one of its 4 legs, and that if that bridle failed in a bigger sea I would go beam on, and I would capsize at night. So I sat up and fixed the bridle. It took 40 minutes with cold hands, and having fixed it, I ate the last 4 apricots I had been saving, which was a decision I had no business making, and which was exactly right. And then I paddled for an hour in the dark, because I was too angry to sit still. The weather came at 4 in the morning, and it blew about 30 knots for 9 hours, and it was the worst part of the entire 6 days, and I got through it because I had fixed a piece of cord. There is no lesson in that except the obvious one, which is that the drill is not for the good days. They found me on the 6th day at about 2:20 in the afternoon. She was a fisheries patrol vessel, a big steel one, 80 meters, grey, and she was running out to the shelf edge to board a vessel that had been flagged for an inspection, and she was doing about 14 knots, and she passed within about 400 meters of me, 400 meters. In a 2-meter swell from the bridge of a ship, a 17-foot yellow kayak is visible perhaps a third of the time and looks exactly like a piece of lost aquaculture gear, of which there is a great deal in Irish waters. What they saw was not the boat, it was the flag. On the 3rd day I had done a piece of work that I am prouder of than anything else in this story. I took my spare split paddle off the foredeck, joined it, and lashed it upright behind my seat, angled back like a mast, and to the top of it I tied my orange bivy bag by 2 corners so that it flew. It was, once it was up, about 2.5 meters above the water and roughly a meter across, and it was safety orange, and it flogged and cracked in the wind constantly for 3 days and drove me half mad, and I never once took it down. I had to take the bag off it every time it rained and put it back up afterwards, which was 10 minutes of work in the cold, and I did it every time. A cadet on the bridge wing of that patrol vessel saw an orange object standing above the swell where nothing should be standing above the swell, and said so. And I want to say this next part carefully, because it is the piece that I find hardest. They had never been told I was missing. Nobody had reported me. There was no search. There was no alert out to shipping, no notice to mariners, nothing. 6 days after I launched from that pier, the Irish Coast Guard had no record of my existence, because the only person who knew I was intending that crossing was in Spain and had understood, reasonably, that I would text her when I got to the island, and had not heard from me, and had assumed I had not gone. My car sat in that gravel pull-in for 6 days, and nobody thought anything of it, because that is a place where people leave cars. So when that ship altered course toward me and put a boat in the water, the men in it had no idea what they were coming to. They thought they were investigating a piece of debris. Their coxswain told me afterwards that when they got within 50 meters and worked it out that there was a person in it, he said a word out loud that he then apologized to me. For they got me out with a lot of care and some difficulty. I could not lift my arms above my shoulders. My legs would not unbend, as I said. They lifted me onto their deck and cut the dry suit off me because the neck seal could not be got over my head with my shoulders in the state they were in, and I made them keep the boat, which they did. They got it aboard with a crane, full of water, and it sat on their aft deck all the way in, and I have it still. They gave me water in a small cup and made me wait, and then more, and a young man sat with me and did nothing else for 2 hours. Somebody brought me sweet tea. Their medic was excellent and extremely calm, and she told me 4 or 5 times over the first hour in a completely level voice exactly what she was doing and why. I had lost 9 kilos in 6 days. My kidneys were unhappy for a week. The immersion foot took a month to sort out properly, and I lost the nails off 2 toes. Nothing permanent. I was extraordinarily lucky, and I know precisely which pieces of that luck were luck and which were preparation, and the ratio is not as flattering as I would like. The aftermath was harder than the drift. That is the thing that nobody tells you, and that I have now heard from 3 other people who have come back from something. There was a certain amount of press, which I dealt with badly. There was a conversation with my sister that I am not going to describe. There was a period of about 4 months where I could not sit in a chair with my legs under a table without a specific, physical, unbearable feeling arriving, which a very good therapist eventually explained to me, and which went away. And there was the reckoning with the beacon, which took about a year, and which I have converted, in the end, into something useful. I talk to paddling clubs now. I do perhaps 6 talks a year, for nothing, and the talk is 40 minutes long, and 35 of it is about tidal planning, and 5 of it is about the beacon in the boot of my car. I have watched 200 people write down the same sentence, which is, it lives on the buoyancy aid, not in the bag, I paddle. Of course I paddle. I was back on the water in 11 weeks, in a sheltered bay, with my sister sitting on a rock watching me and pretending to read, and I did the crossing again in 2019 with 2 other paddlers on a neap tide, launching at exactly the planned minute. We landed at the southern end of that island 4.5 hours after launching, and I sat down on the slipway and had to be left alone for a few minutes. Now, what I think about it, nothing out there was against me. That took me about 2 years to believe properly, and it is the only thing I have that I would want to give anybody. The tide race that took me past that island was not a trap, and it was not bad luck. It runs every spring ebb, twice a month, whether anybody is there or not, and it has run there since the last ice age put that bank where it is, and it is exactly as indifferent to a kayak as it is to a piece of driftwood. The wind was a pressure gradient. The 400 meters between me and that patrol vessel was geometry, and within that indifference, this is the part I would keep if I could only keep one. A fishing float came past with a colony of barnacles on it and fed me for a day. It rained on 4 days out of 6. A basking shark the length of a bus went by at arm's length and looked at nothing. Storm petrels the size of my hand danced on the surface at dusk 500 kilometers from anywhere they could stand. And on the 4th night, in absolute darkness, an entire family of pilot whales came and breathed around a woman in a plastic boat for an hour, and then went away, and I never saw one of them. None of it was for me. That is the whole point, and it is not a sad thought once you have properly had it. It means all of that was going on before I arrived, and it went on after they lifted me out, and it is going on tonight, in the dark, 400 kilometers west of a pier where somebody's car is parked. I used to think that being in a kayak got me closer to the sea than other people. I was quite pleased with myself about it. What I understand now is that it got me closer to the surface, and that the surface is a lid, and that everything I saw in those 6 days, the shark, the sunfish, the barnacles, The whales I could not see came up through that lid for a moment on its own business and went back down. I was in it for 6 days and I saw almost nothing. That is not a disappointment. It is the most interesting fact I know.